What a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street, singing songs and they carrying signs, mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. When people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop children, what's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner. Welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. I'm sorry that I'm starting a few minutes late tonight, but as you can see, we have a new look for the show. And I want to thank my technicians who are here, Johnny and Zach, who helped make this new look possible. So we're going to be perfecting this over the weeks, and tonight we were able to show my intro, and we're going to have some roll-ins. But the other reason why tonight is a special show is because I have a very important guest, and that is Aaron Maté. How are you doing tonight, Aaron?
Hi, Lauren. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's so great. I've been trying to have you for so long because this Russiagate has been an ongoing saga, and now, just when we thought it was over, it seems like it's not really over. I just wanted to introduce you because you are a contributing writer for The Nation magazine. You're a former host and producer for The Real News and Democracy Now! But for the last 2 years, you've written over 20 articles on Russiagate in The Nation alone. So I'm really pleased to have you on here. Now,
thanks for having me.
What do you make of this the latest in the ongoing saga? CNN just posted this 4 hours ago. Take a listen.
Report recommending that the House of Representatives hold Attorney General William Barr in contempt of Congress for defying a valid subpoena issued by this committee. This is not a step we take lightly. It is the culmination of nearly 3 months of requests, discussions, and negotiations with the Department of Justice for the complete unredacted report by Special Counsel Mueller into Russian interference in the 2016 election, along with the underlying evidence. I appreciate the fact that the department responded to the offer we made to them last week and met with us yesterday in a last-minute effort to reach an accommodation. We heard the department out. We responded to...
Yes, I didn't want to play that whole clip. I just wanted to play the first 12 seconds of it, which is basically they're holding him in contempt. And why don't you set the scene? Tell the viewers what happened today.
So, as we heard there from Chairman Gerald Nadler, the House Judiciary Committee voted to hold Attorney General William Barr in contempt because he will not comply with their subpoena. They want him to appear before them and testify, but they wanted him to be questioned not by them themselves, but by their attorneys, but by House Judiciary Committee attorneys. And they also are trying to get a full unredacted report released to Congress, but Barr is arguing that he cannot release the full unredacted report because that would violate the law, because there are laws that bar the disclosure of grand jury material, and that that grand jury material accounts for some of the redactions in the Mueller report. I think all this is a joke and a huge waste of time. I think Democrats have really injured themselves pushing a conspiracy theory for 2 years. One that, as I've argued and a few others have argued, that the evidence was never there for it and that it was going to come back to hurt them. And instead of acknowledging that reality when the judgment day came, when Robert Mueller issued his report, they're now doubling down and they're trying to make this about Barr somehow covering it up. When really, I don't know how they can accuse a guy who released an almost complete report to the public of a cover up. The redactions were done with Robert Mueller's office's cooperation, and they're extremely limited. And we see where they are. They're basically in the case of Roger Stone, which is an ongoing case. And there's some redacted parts when it comes to, counterintelligence matters when it comes to Russia, which, is very common when you have this public disclosure of information that came from the NSA or CIA. And then on the obstruction side, it's barely redacted there. And the obstruction side is the side that is most damning to Trump. And as a reminder, the reason we've seen it is because the Trump White House didn't invoke executive privilege. And William Barr, even though he's not even obligated to release it to the public, he did release it to the public. So I just don't see how possibly House Democrats can make an issue out of this, especially when even on the issues that they claim to be concerned about, if they wanted to get the unredacted report without the grand jury material redacted, they could just pass a bill saying, making an exception to that law that bars the release of grand jury material.
Right.
They have every right to do that.
Right.
And of course, if they wanted to impeach Trump for obstruction, if they believe he obstructed, they could do that too. But their Democratic leadership has killed that, at least for now. So basically, I just see all this as a performance to just refuse to acknowledge the reality that Democrats have forced upon themselves.
Yes, well, it is all kabuki theater right now, and I want to talk to you in a little bit about impeachment because I do think that he should be impeached. I think that Obama should have prosecuted Bush and Cheney. I think whenever you let these things go, he said, we're looking forward, we're not looking back. You give more and more power to the executive branch, and if they do something that is impeachable, I think the process should be gone forward with, even though it's not going to happen because the Republicans control the Senate. And I think that the Democrats can still run an election and they can still present issues that are of importance to the 99% at the same time as doing this. I don't think it has to, take over. But before we talk about that, because I have a clip that Norman Solomon, we talked about this on my show 2 years ago that I wanted to run. I wanted you to go over your article on the 26th, the one that starts with Mueller report indicts, because you went through like 10 different things, and I wanted you to go through it really quickly for people that have not read that article, in which you kind of summarize the Mueller report and everything that that people were counting on them finding and it didn't find. So you called it Russiagate without Russia. They found no evidence that anyone from the Trump campaign talked to anyone from the Kremlin. They spoke to Russian nationals. But there's nothing illegal about that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go through my whole article. If people want to read it, it's up at thenation.com. And I think it's called something like Robert Mueller Indicts the Trump-Russia Conspiracy Theory. And that's because basically, for 2 years, we were led to believe that there was a conspiracy between Trump and Russia and that Robert Mueller would uncover it. And what I try to argue in my article is that instead of indicting Trump for a Trump-Russia conspiracy, Mueller actually presents information that indicts the conspiracy theory. He shows that to be not based in fact. And one illustration of that is what you mentioned, that, there's all this talk about Trump associates and their contacts and their links and their ties to Russia. But all that is sort of it's a semantic way of covering up for the fact that there is no actual contact between Trump and Russia, at least in any significant way, in any way that leads to some kind of conspiracy, which was the whole point of this 2-year investigation. So there are people in the Trump world who speak to Russians and who speak to people who claim to either have connections to Russians or to know Russians or to have contacts with the Russian government. But, ascribing importance to those contacts hides the fact that none of those contacts are of any significance when it comes to the issue of a conspiracy. It's just basically people talking, and there's nothing wrong with people talking. So, for example, when Rob Goldstone, this British music publicist, sends an email to Don Jr. and says that we have compromising information on Hillary Clinton and her dealings with the Russian government, and this information is a part of the Russian government's support for President Donald Trump. And Don Jr. replies that this is what you say, I love it. That then becomes this, smoking gun evidence of collusion for 2 years. But nobody looks at the fact that the Rob Goldstone, the person who sent that email, he wasn't acting on behalf of the Russian government. He's a British music publicist who was trying to get a meeting between his client, a Russian pop star, or on behalf of his client, a Russian pop star, and the Trump campaign. And Rob Goldstone has also said that he made all this up, that actually there was no Russian government support for Trump. There was no even dirt on Hillary Clinton. He was just using publicist puff to get the meeting, and that's why nothing came of it. And Robert Mueller even acknowledges that in his report. So and by the way, Robert Mueller's team do their best to spin the available facts in the most sympathetic way possible for the conspiracy theory, because this conspiracy theory originates with the FBI, and Robert Mueller is was a longtime head of the FBI, and a lot of his staffers, people on his team, come from the FBI, and they even have ties to the Clinton world. And so these are people who actually wrote a very disingenuous report, if you look at it, where they try to suggest, without actually directly stating, because they can't state it because it's not true, that there are Trump ties to the Russian government when they're really not there. And they also skip over a lot of the origins of this whole thing, which, this investigation to begin with doesn't start with any kind of, like, we heard so much about, 3 years ago about Trump contacts with Russian intelligence officials and all this stuff. It's all untrue. It's all falsehoods. We don't hear any of that. And we hear a very sympathetic narrative that paints the FBI's decision to start this investigation in a very sympathetic light, when the evidence was just never there. This case, whatever you think about Robert Mueller's investigation, the case he inherited was just baseless.
Yeah. Well, what about the Steele dossier? I mean, didn't that have some connection to the Clintons also? And so much was was based on what was in that.
Yeah. The Steele dossier was literally paid for by the Clintons and the DNC. And, we don't know if it triggered the initial Trump-Russia probe. We don't know that yet. I suspect it played a bigger role than has been publicly acknowledged. But we do know that it was used to get a surveillance warrant on Carter Page, who by that time had left the Trump campaign. But Steele names him in the Steele dossier as being like a liaison between Russia and Trump, and that Carter Page was offered billions of dollars in the Russian state oil company if he could lift sanctions. So the FBI wrote in a FISA warrant that was later released that the FBI believes that Carter Page is coordinating between Trump and the Russian government. And they cited the Steele dossier for that. And they disclosed that Steele was doing political opposition research, but they didn't disclose who was paying for it. So in terms of questionable, to put it very charitably, investigative decisions early on, that's certainly one of them. We just don't know if the Steele dossier is what's triggered the probe. What triggered the probe is supposedly campaign advisor George Papadopoulos hearing that the Russians have dirt on Hillary Clinton, and he apparently overheard that before the DNC emails were released. So that led the FBI to suspect, well, maybe this guy heard about the stolen emails before everybody else knew, and maybe and we think he heard about it from the Russians. But of course, that turned out to go absolutely nowhere as well, because the person that he heard it from, this mysterious professor, Joseph Mifsud, has no connections to the Russian government in any serious way. I mean, he's been to Russia. He knows some Russians. He was interviewed by the FBI in February of 2017 in Washington, D.C. He was let go. He was never arrested, never charged. And he was never charged, even though Robert Mueller says in the report that this guy Mifsud lied to him. Well, meanwhile, Mueller charged other people like George Papadopoulos with lying to him. So why didn't he charge Mifsud, the supposed spark of the entire Trump-Russia probe? And that is field speculation that is because the FBI is maybe hiding something on him, that maybe this guy actually is a Western intelligence linked person who was trying to entrap the Trump campaign somehow.
Yeah, well,
I'm not endorsing that view, but I'm saying it's because the question's still unanswered. It's one possibility.
I wasn't following the ins and outs of this to the same extent that you were. I was following your work briefly just because you were reinforcing my beliefs for the last 2 years that this was all BS. But one thing that I do remember that you referenced in your article was Kislyak. And when Michael Flynn asked him for restraint after Obama closed those embassies and sent those ambassador's home. I thought that was actually a great idea. That's not the... Oh,
Yeah, well, so it's an example. See, the problem with following the story is it's so dense. You have to read so much stuff, and ultimately it's useless. It actually is useless in terms of like this being a story of political significance when you compare it to all the real issues that impact people's lives. And so
right. But
it's
what I'm saying about Kislyak is that...
I was just saying that I don't blame anybody for not following this, because the problem though is that every single detail has been spun by political and media elites who have converged around this Russiagate thing for different but converging elite interests, I think, which I could talk about if you'd like.
Right.
And they've spun all the available facts to fit a narrative. So in the case of Michael Flynn, he is wiretapped speaking to the Russian ambassador. Somebody leaks that wiretap, which is pretty extraordinary, which shows that they're out. Basically, they have a bone to pick with Michael Flynn. And I have speculation as to why that is, but it doesn't really matter. Anyway, and then this gets spun into this belief that Michael Flynn and the Russian ambassador are talking about a payoff for Russia's assistance to Trump during the campaign, and they're doing this secret dealing, and it's all shady. When really, what we know from the transcript is that Michael, or at least all the available information that's been released in the Mueller indictment, and the Mueller report, and what's been reported, is that Michael Flynn basically asked the Russian ambassador not to escalate in response to sanctions that Obama imposed on his way out the door. And, but yet Michael Flynn was, if you watched MSNBC, Michael Flynn was the possible traitor. And because he was cooperating with Mueller, he was going to testify against Trump. It was all this big thing, But it's actually a case where if you look at the available facts, the only thing really damning about Flynn's interactions with Kislyak are, in fact, actually lead us to the only documented case of Trump collusion with a foreign power that we know of to date, which is Trump's collusion with Israel. Because the first call that Flynn made to Kislyak, which also was wiretapped and which he also lied about, was, or at least he was also convicted of lying about, was his call to Kislyak to ask Kislyak to veto a measure at the UN that Obama was going to let pass that condemned Israeli settlement building in occupied territories. And basically, Sheldon Adelson and Benjamin Netanyahu personally asked the Trump campaign to kill that measure. And so the Trump campaign called everyone they could, including Kislyak, to try to convince them to veto it, which failed. But, the fact that that hasn't gotten any attention, or at least way less attention, even though that's a documented case of real collusion with the foreign power, it shows you just how disingenuous this whole thing is and how kind of hypocritical the concern is about foreign interference.
Well, I was just paying attention to the Kislyak thing because it put me in mind of Bobby Kennedy having a back channel to Khrushchev during his brother's administration, because they had to sort of posture these really hard-line positions, the two countries against each other, when really there was this back channel and Bobby Kennedy was trying to keep everything very, even-keeled. So when I heard that this happened with Kislyak and that he said he urged restraint on Putin's part, I thought that was actually a good thing. But of course, in this conspiracy theory, they wanted to make it seem like a bad thing. So let's talk about Rachel Maddow, because she was the one, I would say, and I know that Matt Taibbi is writing a book on this and he's going to spend considerable time on her, but you just did an epic Twitter thread on April 28th in which you showed a full 24 instances where you're saying, well, what about that now, Rachel, pretty much. Let's just watch a couple of them. We have a couple of them.
In unclassified form, in black and white, China and Russia can do this today, now, whenever they want to. In other words, we're relying on their good graces that they're not. And it is like negative 50 degrees in
it's loaded.
The Dakotas right now. What would happen if Russia killed the power in Fargo today? Right? What would happen if all the natural gas lines that service Sioux Falls just poofed on the coldest day in recent memory, and it wasn't in our power whether or not to turn them back on? I mean, what would you do if you lost heat indefinitely as the act of a foreign power on the same day the temperature in your front yard matched the temperature in Antarctica. I mean, what would you and your family do?
I mean, she's literally scaring the shit out of people, and it reminds me. I'm old enough to remember duck and cover. I mean, when I went to elementary school in the '60s, we had to, do these drills in which we hid under our desk. I mean, she is literally scaring the shit out of people to create this boogeyman that is Russia. I'm just wondering, what do you think is her motivation? I mean, a lot of people think it's the $7 million. I guess now she's making $10 million from Comcast. But somehow I'm wondering if there's some cognitive dissonance going on, which she's actually convinced herself that all this bullshit is true. What is your take on it?
Well, just to say on the issue of fear, first of all, there's an interesting irony here that, we're told constantly that Russia's goal is to sow fear and chaos in the U.S. with its, releases of stolen emails, allegedly stolen emails, and with its social media clickbait, this juvenile trash that nobody saw that came from a Russian troll farm. So that was this supposed existential threat that's been compared to Pearl Harbor and 9/11, this attack on our country that is supposed to sow fear and chaos. Well, who has sowed more fear and division and chaos than Russiagate promoters like Rachel Maddow for the last 2 years? They've spun this idea that our president is a compromised Kremlin agent and is doing Russia's bidding. They've sowed this idea that the election was stolen from the rightful winner, Hillary Clinton, and there was even talk after Trump won of trying to get the Electoral College delegates to vote against them. And now they're sowing fear like this, where Rachel Maddow is telling millions of people that Russia has the ability to cut off their heat and kill people by freezing them to death. I mean, it's crazy. And so, like, the biggest disinformation campaign that we're facing is not some stupid Russian one, whatever that actually is.
Yeah.
It's an American disinformation campaign to convince Americans that they're threatened by Russia, by Russian clickbait, social media, by Russian hacked emails, and by Russia fictitiously being able to turn off our power. So, it speaks to how so much of Russiagate really is a projection. And that is why I think, I don't want to individually analyze Maddow because I don't know what's in her head, but I will say that for liberal elites in general, Trump's victory was a huge humiliation. They all told us that Hillary was going to win, and they all identify with Hillary Clinton. And Hillary Clinton's loss was in part, not entirely, but was in part because enough voters rejected the neoliberal economic legacy and military legacy as well when it comes to interventions abroad that Hillary Clinton represents. And because elite pundits like Maddow are and her colleagues on MSNBC are totally identified with that faction of the elite, it became convenient for them to basically, instead of saying, well, maybe this is a result of policies that we've turned a blind eye to or that we've supported, it became convenient to blame it all on Russia and to be convinced that it was the result of some grand conspiracy. Because, had they tried to reflect seriously on Trump's election, it also would have meant challenging the economic system that they benefit from, because Trump duped enough people into believing that he was a working class champion, that he was going to drain the swamp. Well, these people have been serving the swamp's interests and have been representing the interests of corporate power. And so for them to be able to do their jobs, for them to have done the proper reflection would have meant actually changing the way they do their jobs and actually challenging powerful interests, the same ones that own these media networks and that sell advertisements to them. It would have meant challenging them. And so that would threaten their own place within the power structure. And so rather than doing that, saying this was all a big result of a conspiracy was convenient. And also it allows them to continue to pose as being, brave truth tellers, as being adversarial. So, by saying by digging for the truth about Trump and Russia, it's a very safe way to pose as being a actual journalist because you're on the surface challenging Trump. But in reality, you're only advancing a baseless conspiracy theory. You're not challenging Trump in any serious way. You're not calling attention to the interests that he represents for the most part. I mean, there are exceptions, obviously, and you're ultimately actually handing Trump a massive gift, because when this collapses, this has really helped Trump, as as we're
Right.
seeing now with its approval ratings up. And of course, there's also the imperative of ratings. So this was very good for MSNBC's ratings. It wasn't doing so well before Trump. It's done great since, and spinning this fantasy of a compromised president and the superhero Robert Mueller was going to save the day, basically giving people a soap opera every day with all the characters, these kooky characters in the Trump camp who were going to
Right.
be the keys to collusion, and then the hero Robert Mueller, and they were the brave truth tellers on the sidelines trying to get to the truth. It was good for their ratings, but it was bad for the rest of the country because it channeled so much liberal energy into this unhinged conspiracy theory mindset.
Right. Well, one thing that I, as an organizer, learned: people make decisions not based on facts and reason, but on emotion. And emotion is evoked by these stories. So you have to have heroes, you have to have villains. And when Bernie Sanders calls out, it's just too bad that they couldn't use the Koch brothers as the billionaires, or Sheldon Adelson, but those are the people that pay their bills, exactly what you said. So, I mean, in my opinion, and I'd like your thoughts on this, in my opinion, there's multiple reasons for this. One, Hillary Clinton and the Democrats had their reason to explain her loss, and they were already working on this, before it all came out. Also, I feel like the media wants to get ratings and have this Tom Clancy-like story that people can follow and tune in to the latest episode every day. That's also why they gave Trump $5 billion worth of free advertising, and they're more responsible, ironically, than, anything they're trying to say is responsible. But the final thing, and the thing that I think is the most dangerous reason for this, is the military-industrial intelligence complex backed by Wall Street trying to foment this new Cold War, which hopefully will turn into a hot war against a major nuclear superpower. Because right now they don't make a lot of money. These weapons manufacturers do not make a lot of money fighting terrorists, where there's guerrilla warfare in the countryside or in the urban areas. But if they can create Russia, and now China, they're doing it to China as the new boogeyman. I did a show on that. Now all of a sudden you can, really pump up the arms race, and you can see they're getting out of the nuclear deals, and we're 2 minutes away from midnight on the doomsday clock. So what do you think? I think it's a bunch of reasons.
Well, exactly. And this is why I said before that Russiagate is a convergence of privileged interests. And I totally agree with you that those who want to foment a new Cold War and who profit from tensions with Russia are a very big driver here. I mean, we know that the FBI even opened up a counterintelligence probe of Trump as being a possible Russian agent in May 2017. Not based on any evidence, not because they had any, wiretaps of Trump people talking to Russians or anything like that, but because Trump was saying nice things about Vladimir Putin, and he was talking about wanting to work with Russia, and he was declining to criticize Russia in his public statements. And that so freaked out people at the FBI that they couldn't come up with an explanation beyond speculating that Trump might be doing Vladimir Putin's bidding. And that's the Cold War mindset that's, like afflicted the national security state establishment. That's why you have, we have these texts and emails now from a couple of the FBI agents who launched the Trump-Russia probe, Peter Strzok and FBI lawyer Lisa Page, and they talk about, I fucking hate the Russians, and these lying motherfuckers and stuff like that. There's a real sort of Cold War mindset in the national security state. It is very profitable. Trump alarmed those people on the campaign trail when he talked about having better relations with Russia. And I'm not sure what that was about exactly on Trump's part. I suspect it was just motivated by the fact he wanted to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. And so he wanted to use, according to Michael Cohen, Trump saw the campaign as an infomercial for Trump branded properties. And so it wouldn't surprise me if Trump's warm words for Vladimir Putin resulted from that. But if they're resulting from Trump's intent to impress Vladimir Putin by convincing him to let him build a hotel that didn't ultimately get built, that does not help the conspiracy theory. It actually undermines it. But
Yeah.
but certainly national security state officials were very alarmed by that. And that's why you had so many Republicans even turning on Trump during the campaign. There was this, you saw these letters from all these former top national security state officials during the campaign denouncing Trump and calling him a danger, and specifically singling out his criticism of the U.S. proxy war in Syria, of interventions in Libya, and him calling for better ties with Russia. And so, those interests, that animosity on the part of people in power towards improving ties with Russia, I think converges with, as you mentioned, the neoliberal Democrats need an excuse to fault for their catastrophic loss. And the media, both who got this wrong and who promoted Trump, now sees a way to deflect from that, and also a great ratings opportunity. So the whole thing is really, it's a privilege protection racket in the guise of this brave search for truth and this effort to defend the country from a foreign conspiracy.
Well, I'm wondering how you talk to your colleagues. Now, I'm in a very progressive bubble. I don't have very many people on Facebook that I had to do a victory lap with when this whole thing was disproved. I mean, there was only, maybe I can count on one hand the number of people that I associate with who still thought there was a there. But you're there in Washington, or no, actually you're in New York or Washington. Where are you based?
I'm based in New York, but
you work in the profession. I do this show. I've been doing it for 2 years. It's a labor of love for me. Nobody pays me. I don't have to go out and get jobs doing journalism. I cover what I want when I want. Yeah. I mean, but you're in that field, and I just kind of want to get it from a personal view. How have you felt these past years being this lone voice, just constantly debunking this? How do you feel amongst your peers, your professional peers? Have people rejected you, shunned you, or what does it feel like to be the chief debunker of Russiagate?
Yes, no, I've definitely been rejected. Speaking from like the lefty progressive adversarial side, I think there was a really shallow level of political thinking here, that because neoliberal Democrats and MSNBC decided that Trump was a Russian agent and that they were going to prioritize this above everything else, this sort of became the fashionable way to, and the prevailing way to oppose Trump. So it was, and if you doubted it, you were smeared as somehow defending Trump. Now, even putting aside the partisan question, whether that's even true, that to me is an irrelevant question, because as a journalist, we're supposed to follow the facts. We're not partisan activists. Now, I personally am partisan, and I have my political beliefs, and I'm open about them. But whatever my political beliefs are those are divorced from what the facts are. And as journalists, it's our job to follow the facts. And unfortunately, I think because this just became so fashionable and so widespread, it became difficult for even really smart people I respect, have known for a long time, to think clearly here and to see the facts for what they were. And the facts constantly undermined the conspiracy theory. And that's why, from a political angle, I also said from the beginning that this whole thing was a disaster, because it might look like Trump is angry about it. It might look like Trump is going down, but this thing was baseless, and it stood to ultimately hand Trump a massive gift when it collapsed. And actually, by the way, it handed him not even a gift when it collapsed, but also it handed him a gift throughout it, because it diverted liberal progressive energy into a conspiracy theory. And so we were marching to protect Mueller, and we were marching when Jeff Sessions got fired. We weren't really marching, or at least we're not marching in nearly large enough numbers when Trump passed the tax heist.
Yeah.
This upward transfer of wealth from the lower income classes to the rich.
Yeah.
So it sapped liberal energies. It put it all into a conspiracy theory. So, which is a huge gift to Trump while he's carrying out these policies, and an even bigger gift to Trump when it collapses, because now he can head into 2020 claiming, vindication and all that. So,
right. Well,
I thought politically this was a disaster, and journalistically just really reckless. But unfortunately, people who I've known for a while and who I respect, I think got swept up in it. And I don't know what this. It's weird. And yes, I can tell you personally, I have suffered some professional consequences for it. And I don't regret it, because I think the facts are on my side, and I stuck to my principles, and I'm proud of that. And but it has been difficult. And what I've learned is, as you spoke to before, people are guided by sometimes, so, as we all are. I'm not immune to this either. We're guided by our emotions and those emotions blind us to the facts. And also, look, there was a material incentive to going along with this. So, if you bought into the Trump Russia conspiracy theory, you could probably get on MSNBC, you can get on NPR, because this was the prevailing narrative. If you didn't, you're cast to the side, presented as crazy. The same thing that always happens with any kind of huge issue where there's convergence across, the establishment spectrum on a certain issue.
Yeah.
So, and unfortunately, many adversarial and progressive outlets, and I'll name a couple, The Intercept, Democracy Now!, some colleagues of mine at The Nation, of course, Mother Jones, and a really, all of these outlets to varying degrees drank the Kool-Aid. And, and that's part of the problem now. I'm getting accountability is everyone went along with it. So it's kind of like no one wants to admit that they got swept up in it.
Right. Like I saw Ted Lieu. Okay, now he's my congressman, and I want to show you a clip from 2 years ago. This is April 2017. I went to his town hall specifically to make this comment about Russiagate. And this was at the point where I was just getting my information from Consortium News. So Ray McGovern, Bill Binney, that's who I was reading at that time. Play the clip, guys. Interfered in 80 elections and overthrew 3 Democrats. So needless to say, I cannot stand Donald Trump. But he will not be impeached by the Republicans as long as they have the majority. 16 intelligence agencies have offered no proof that the Russians hacked the election. In fact, former intelligence agents like Ray McGovern and William Binney dispute this. Even so, our CIA interfered in 80 elections and overthrew 3 democratically elected leaders. 20 years ago, Time magazine did a cover story on how our advisors worked to... No, I don't have to ask the question. I can make the comment. Worked to ensure that Yeltsin won the election in Russia. This is an excuse by Democratic superdelegates for losing the election because I don't have to ask the question. I'm making a comment. Who sabotaged ran a bad candidate who sabotaged Bernie, who could have beaten Trump. Now, shut up. You are fomenting a new Cold War with Russia. Trump is mentally unstable. He will start a war to prove he is not in cahoots with Putin. I think that's why he bombed Syria. Democrats will never take back the House in 2018 unless you start using your bully pulpit on Twitter and cable news to talk about the issues that concern the American people, like a living wage, affordable health care, crushing student debt, and free public college. So that was me being heckled by a liberal West Side Los Angeles audience. And it's just endemic that these people were eating up everything that the spooks were saying. I went to a thing with Jane Fonda. Remember how she was so pilloried for her role in the Vietnam War, consorting with the North Vietnamese? She was actually quoting something that I don't remember which CIA director or FBI director was saying on Rachel Maddow, but she said it parenthetically to the audience. Can you believe I'm quoting the FBI? And no, I couldn't believe that she was quoting the FBI, and I couldn't believe that she wasn't skeptical about that. So, yeah.
It's a reflection, I think, of how sort of shook people were by Trump. Trump's victory was a real sort of traumatic event for many people. And so I get it. Like, I get where the fear came from, and in moments of fear where, it's comforting to seek for the answers. And the answer that was presented to us by John Brennan and other CIA people, very disingenuously, because they fooled everybody, was that Trump was probably a Russian agent and conspired with Russia, when really they were doing that for their own cynical ends, because they wanted to undermine the prospects of better relations with Russia, because tensions with Russia were profitable for them and justified the existence, really, of national security state officials like John Brennan and those who he identifies with. But unfortunately, it just became very binary, where it's like since Trump is evil, anybody who opposes him must be good and must be telling the truth. And we just didn't do the kind of political thinking that we needed to do. And hopefully now with the collapse of the conspiracy theory, I'm hoping people can reflect on that. And again, it's a dynamic that every human does. We all want to. It's easy to believe things when it's convenient and comforting, and I think it's understandable, but it's been catastrophic. I think it's been horrible for the left. It's turned so much of the left into like Russophobes, where chauvinism and xenophobia is now acceptable.
Yeah.
Where we're supposed to, it's adopting a lot of the same rhetoric and mindset of the McCarthy era. It's sad, and of course it's used, of course, on real progressives, which is of course part of the point. So that's why Bernie Sanders, Tulsi Gabbard, Jill Stein, all these articles about them being promoted by Russian social media bots and them being helped by Russia. I mean, it's garbage. I mean, to the extent that I mean, so much of this quote unquote research is incredibly shaky. They're not even sure sometimes if it comes from Russia. Their math is off, all this stuff. But the point is not the math, the figures. The point is they're doing this because they want to taint real progressives. And that is always, if not an explicit goal, it's at least a side benefit for establishment liberals when they latch onto something, is to discredit the actual left. And that's what then they've certainly used that with this Russia thing.
And there's a cottage industry coming up from it. I mean, I did a show earlier this year with Dan Cohen about new knowledge and basically the debunking the whole disinformation campaign. But they're still pushing it. I mean, on April 19th, Politico ran an article on how this Russia disinformation is starting up again. And the research firm that was, can you show that clip from Politico? Or I'm sorry, was it the Politico video. But while you're queuing that up, I'll just say the research firm that was the basis for this conclusion was called Guardian AI. So this is a new one. Yeah. Do you have the clip? Okay.
Attack. You thought I was going to say underway. No, under attack. A new report from Politico reveals disinformation campaigns are happening. Is going to say underway. The 2020 election, it is already under attack. You thought I was going to say underway. No, under attack. A new report from Politico reveals disinformation campaigns are happening as we speak, and they mirror Russia's interference in the 2016 election. Politico now reporting the main targets appear to be Democratic presidential candidates: Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and prospective candidate Beto O'Rourke. The attacks are in the form of misinformation posted about the candidates, you guessed it, on Twitter and other social media platforms.
Okay, so yeah, and later in the story, the Politico reporter they interviewed actually said there is no conclusive evidence that Russia is behind this, but there are probable patterns that indicate this is the case. And later she said that a lot of this is domestic activity, but some of it is foreign. So it's like they can't help themselves.
Well, so again, this is an American disinformation campaign about Russian disinformation. So if you look at how MSNBC titles that video, if I remember right, they put Russian disinformation in there. So even though they don't even know that it comes from Russia. So this is it's like, if you think about how pathetic it is, I mean, at least during the Cold War, they could fearmonger, about nuclear war, which it's at a certain point was a very real prospect. Then it became the Sandinistas. The Sandinistas are a couple of days drive from Texas. So we've seen how fear-mongering has worked over the years. It was the Sandinistas, then it was Saddam Hussein, then it was terrorists after 9/11. Now it's devolved down to Russian
clickbait farms.
Russian clickbait farms and stolen emails. Because if you look at what the clickbait farms actually put out, it's a joke. It's hilarious. Like, first of all, the scale of it was so tiny.
Sam.
They spent like $100,000 on Facebook ads. Most of those ads ran after the election. The vast majority of those ads weren't even about the election. They were targeted at certain demographic groups, which, as New Knowledge points out in its report, as Oxford points out in its report, because there was two reports that the Senate commissioned, Oxford and New Knowledge. Oxford says that the tactics that the IRA, the Russian troll farm, used are consistent with a commercial clickbait firm, which is basically what it was. They're targeting certain demographics to get likes, attract followers, and then sell their, like leverage their audience reach to advertisers. I mean, It's pretty, but yet all this gets, and as you mentioned, there's, like the most popular Facebook or Instagram post was a cartoon of Yosemite Sam talking about how they want to take away his gun. I mean, it's a joke. Yet this is like, we're supposed to believe impacted swung the 2016 election. There's a New Yorker article by Jane Mayer about this, about how Russian trolls likely swung the election for Trump. I mean, it's like the scale of propaganda here it's just insane. I haven't seen anything like it in my lifetime. And of course, the contempt underlying all of it for average people, right, is pretty staggering when you think about it, because no elite politician or pundit could ever look at any of these stupid Russian social media posts and say, yes, this could have possibly swayed my vote if I had been exposed to them, right? None of them would ever say that it would have swayed their vote. So then how much contempt are they expressing for average American voters in declaring, not even speculating, but in declaring that these stupid clickbait posts swayed the votes of voters? So how malleable do they think voters are to think that these dumb posts could impact their vote? And also, how much contempt do they have for us that they think that we can believe all this?
Yeah, well, 2 years ago, I did a show on when Rachel Maddow did that story about how they invaded all those Bernie Sanders pages, and they specifically talked about the Bernie-crats of San Diego, and I had the woman on who administered that Facebook page, and she said it's patently ridiculous. Half of that stuff we removed, and the other half, we're not going to believe it. And how stupid, like you just said, do you think Bernie Sanders people are voting for him based on his policies, not because of any stupid clickbait stuff?
Not based on some comments written in bad English on a Facebook page.
I want to close the show talking about Venezuela, because that is also right now being very heavily influenced by propaganda. Yesterday, I was listening to my local NPR station, and they were interviewing a Venezuelan family who operate a Venezuelan restaurant here in Los Angeles. And she was basically talking about how the people there are starving, how the Maduro government is preventing them from getting food. And the real giveaway was when she said everything was fine until the communists took over. Mm-hmm. And the thing was that the reporter who was sent out to interview her and the host of this segment were not challenging any of this. And I've done 2 shows on Venezuela now with Ben Norton and Lucas Kerner, who's actually in Caracas. I did one with Kevin Zeese, who's holding down the embassy right now for the Maduro government. And it's very clear that the real cause of, and first of all, it is not a humanitarian crisis. They won't interview Albert Zelaya, who is the UN rapporteur who came back and said this is not a humanitarian crisis, as is the case with, say, Darfur. Ben Norton showed the supermarkets full of all sorts of products. And what's happening is the American sanctions and keeping the money from Citgo and freezing the money, the gold in London, and the trade embargoes that we're forcing our trading partners. So that's the problem. We're fomenting a coup d'etat right now in this other country, and we've brought in Bolton, and we've brought in, Elliot Abrams, who was responsible for all that stuff in Latin America in the 80s. And the mainstream media is playing along with it. I mean, you did an article about Venezuela. We have the screenshot of, you did an article in the Gray Zone Project about Rachel Maddow is now hopping on this. And I'm very concerned because the police down in D.C., I've been watching Medea Benjamin's live streams daily. Today, they just arrested 2 more people from Code Pink for doing absolutely nothing, whereas they're letting the opposition protesters have their way with everything. They're actually flashing lights into the embassy at night. They're playing these loud noises. I mean, it was reminiscent of Abu Ghraib to try to, get those protesters to come out of that. I shouldn't say protesters. They're actually invited by the Maduro government, but to get them, the protectors, the embassy protectors, to come out. And I couldn't even get Ryan Grimm to go and cover that. I've been trying to get him for a week to cover that. And he's like waiting for, something to happen for them to be evicted. And I'm like, no, this is an ongoing story. So,
Well, what just happened is the last I heard, but before we went on air, is that actually they cut the power to the embassy. So now they're without electricity inside.
oh, wow.
And today, I know a few people were arrested as they and roughed up as they tried to deliver food.
Right.
So in an interesting way, there's sort of a lot of parallels here to what is the U.S. strategy to Venezuela itself. Because as you say, the U.S. has been cutting off Venezuela from the world with these murderous sanctions, and it's fair to call them murderous because there's just been a study put out by
Jeffrey Sachs
and Mark Weisbrot of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, saying that these sanctions have led to the deaths of tens of thousands.
40,000 Venezuelans, yeah.
Which is what sanctions always do. The point of sanctions is not really to hurt leaders of countries, because leaders always do fine. It's to hurt the people in the bid to make them suffer enough to throw out the leaders that our elites decide that we don't like. And look, in the case of Venezuela, I was there in February, and I can say that there's a really interesting internal Venezuelan conversation to be had about the Maduro government and the decisions they've made. And I've heard a lot of the critiques. And I think you can make a very strong case. They made some really bad decisions that when it comes to currency and price controls, and not putting enough into their reserves in case the price of oil dropped. And there's a corruption issue there. There are serious issues there. I mean, and there is an economic crisis, and we can't deny that. There certainly is not a humanitarian crisis, at least according to what I saw. I was only in Caracas, but I think it's fair to say that the supermarkets, as you mentioned, had plenty of food. It was a matter of prices, and the prices for some things were unaffordable, and that is a result of many factors, including the sanctions and also speculation. People profiting off of high prices, and also you have and this gets to the whole thing about communists. The elites in Venezuela have been largely left alone, so
Right.
they still have their fancy malls and neighborhoods, and you can still buy so many of the things that you can get everywhere else. The difference, though, is that the Chavista movement has used the country's resources for the benefit of the poor majority,
Right.
and that's why the elites there and the elites here hate them and want to kick them out. I mean, not to say that Maduro hasn't made some bad decisions. I think I've heard the critiques, and I think Venezuela possibly could have avoided some of this mess, I think, if it had made better decisions. But you know what? Obama made terrible decisions. Bush and Bill Clinton basically destroyed the economy here. But the difference, though, is that when they destroyed the economy, they didn't have an even larger superpower breathing down their neck, imposing harsh sanctions and cutting them off from financial markets. So, if we cared about Venezuela's plight, what we do is we'd stop the sanctions, we'd stop economic warfare, and we leave it alone. And whatever internal problems they have, we leave it to them to decide. And that includes, stopping to prop up a, far right opposition that, has ran in elections. I think like the figure is 23 of the past 25 elections. The Chavismo movement has won. The last election was contested, but part of the problem was that the opposition boycotted it. And when one member of the opposition didn't want to boycott and he ran, the U.S. threatened him with sanctions, and he was
Wow.
pressured. So, there's a real bad faith sabotage effort on the part of those who claim to be standing up to Maduro's tyranny, because part of the problem is they're just not that popular. And when they run in elections, with the exception of twice, the last 25, they've lost. And so, this is not to say that Maduro's perfect. There's plenty of critiques you can make, but it's for us in the West, it's kind of academic. Like, who cares? It's not really our business. In the same way that Obama made terrible decisions. He didn't prosecute anybody from Wall Street. He could have nationalized the auto industry, which would have been saved a lot of jobs, and and actually put the auto industry on much better footing. Instead, he rescued it out with federal money and handed it back to the private sector. So it's fine to criticize leaders for their economic decisions. I'm all for it, but it's like, the conversation is so disingenuous because it ignores the fact that it's none of our business what these leaders do. And also it ignores the fact that we are making life impossible for them to recover with these horrible sanctions and economic warfare.
Okay, one final question. I lied before I let you go because I don't know if I'm going to be able to get you on because you're so hard to get before the election. Do you think that the DNC and the powers that be are going to be able to successfully sabotage Bernie? I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and I know you're not, and we've talked about debunking the Russiagate conspiracy theorists, but I'm starting to think there's a reason that 21 candidates, that every Democrat and his uncle is running, and I'm thinking it is because they want to keep Bernie from getting 51%, and they want to have to go to the second ballot when the superdelegates can make the decision. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, listen, I have no information. I don't know. I would never underestimate the cynicism of neoliberals. I mean, we've learned that many times over. I grew up under Bill Clinton, and I saw what a phony he was, how cynical he was, and sort of, claiming, like when he was campaigning for president, executing a mentally ill black man, calling out Sister Souljah because he wanted to appeal to white racists, overseeing a huge jump in mass incarceration and boosting of the prison industrial complex. And then, of course, painting himself as being a friend to black people because he played the saxophone on the Arsenio Hall show, Yeah. So the point is, and then, of course, with what the DNC did to Bernie in 2016 and what they're still doing now, what the Clintons are still doing now by fomenting the Trump-Russia conspiracy theory. And just this past weekend, Hillary Clinton was talking about how the election was stolen from her. So I never doubt the disingenuousness and the cynicism of these people and their pathological hatred for actual progressives, because actual progressives are the biggest threat to their privilege, because actual progressives like Bernie showed them to be phonies, people who claim to be, socially liberal and to care about justice, when really their policies show that they don't. So I wouldn't put anything past them. I just don't know, and we'll see. I do think that Bernie has changed things. He's made it impossible for a major candidate to not adopt certain left positions like Medicare for all and free college, or at least a massively less expensive college. So I think Bernie's done a great service. I will say that if somehow it's not Bernie and Elizabeth Warren gets the nomination, I'd personally still see that as a huge improvement over everyone else, every other Democratic candidate, at least in my lifetime that I've seen. I personally favor Bernie, but the fact is, I do think that the resurgent progressive movement that Bernie Sanders helped galvanize has made the space for people who are more progressive more possible. And so I do think we're seeing a different field than we saw in 2016, a different climate than we saw in 2016, where back then Hillary Clinton was the favorite, but now Bernie's considered a front runner, and I think that bodes well, and we'll see just how far the cynicism goes and how the DNC leadership handles his continued popularity.
Okay, well, I'm going to let you go so I can promote my upcoming show, but I want to thank you so much for being on the show, and I look forward to continuing to read your great writing.
Lauren, thanks very much. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Okay. So guys, some of you may be new to my show. This is called The Robust Opposition because I focus on activism and organizing. I do not just national stuff. I actually do most of my work in Los Angeles and in the state of California. I do a lot of live streaming. Today I live streamed the protest of the ride sharers who went on strike for one-day strike, 10 cities in the U.S. and several other countries, in anticipation of the Uber initial public offering, which is tomorrow, where the CEO is going to be making $600 million. The founder is going to be making about $6 billion. And Jeff Bezos is going to be making about $800 million. So everybody's making money off of this. Meanwhile, the drivers got their pay cut 53% over the past few years. They're flooding the market with drivers, so people can't really make a living. And the average wage, I think, is about $5.53 an hour. So they are trying to strike. They had a strike today. They're trying to make their plight known to the public. And we were talking about how all these issues are connected. They're not being able to afford their rent because the rent is going up, not being able to afford their health care, et cetera, et cetera. This is something that Bernie Sanders is talking about. I addressed it in my Ted Lieu video. Unless politicians start addressing the needs of the people, we're never going to get anywhere. Now, tomorrow I'm going to be covering a protest outside of the Broad stage in Santa Monica. Eli Broad is a billionaire who is pushing education privatization. But the reason we're protesting tomorrow is Scott Wiener, a state senator here in California, is pushing a bill, SB 50, that is going to devastate single-family zoning throughout the state of California under the guise of trying to have more dense housing around transit stops. It's going to ruin a lot of low-income communities for the benefit of real estate developers. So I'm going to be covering that tomorrow around 6 p.m. live on my Facebook page. And then next Wednesday, I'm going to be doing a show on this assembly district election in our local assembly district here, where there's a lot of corruption and rigging going on in the California Democratic Party. There was one election, a group challenged it, so they had another election. Now the people who lost that election are challenging it, and it's going to go all the way to the state party convention, which is going to be at the end of May, that I'm going to be covering. There's a big chairs race again this year between an establishment candidate and a progressive, and I was covering it 2 years ago when the guy who won, Eric Bauman, was recently forced out because of sexual harassment allegations. And what else can I tell you? Just check my page, check my YouTube channel. I did a great 2-part interview with Daniel Ellsberg a couple of weeks ago. I did an interview with Dr. Jill Stein. I did an interview with Ro Khanna. I'm going to be doing another interview with Ro Khanna, one with Pramila Jayapal, whose Medicare for All bill was recently introduced. And I have got an interview with Varshini Prakash, the founder of the Sunrise Movement, and I'm trying to get an interview with Nina Turner. She said she'd give me one. I love Nina. So if you're first tuning in, I'm on YouTube, lauren.steiner.la. Well, actually, that's my Facebook page, lauren.steiner.la. YouTube is Lauren from LA, and Twitter is Lauren_Steiner. So as I always end my show, keep fighting.